Guys, it's me again for the third and final country of the day. It is like slightly different format to what I've just done in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Is yes, the space on my tablet is running out, as Saudi Arabia was that long. And as Australia is an interesting country, as we've kind of been living on it for thousands of years. As the first during the 17th and 18th centuries, European explorers had reached Australia, and in 1770, Captain Cook claimed Eastern Australia for Britain in what he later called New South Wales, and life was hard for the ordinary people. In the 18th century, punishment for even minor crimes was severe. In England, you could be hanged for more than 200 different offences. However, as an alternative, hanging prisoners were sometimes sentenced to transportation. In the 18th century, convicts were transported to Virginia and Maryland, in what is now the USA. The transportation was a relatively humane punishment. I don't know, and it was considerably better than hanging. After the American War of Independence from 1775 to 1783, it was no longer possible as the government began looking for a new destination for the transportees. In 1786, they decided to send them to Botany Bay. Getting rid of undesirable members of the society may not have been the sole motive for founding a colony in Australia. The British may have hoped to found a naval base in the Pacific, as they hoped Australia would be a source of timber and flax. Anyways, on the 13th of May 1787, a fleet of 11 ships set sail from Portsmouth. On board were 759 convicts. Most of them were men, with sailors and marines to guard them as prisoners, as Captain Arthur Phillip commanded them. And with them we took seeds and farm implements, livestock such as cattle, sheep and pigs, goats, horses and chickens, and 2 years' supply of food. The first colonists came ashore at Port Jackson on 26th of January 1788, as the first things were difficult for the colonists, as food was short, so Philip sent a ship to South Africa for more provisions, which returned in May 1789. Food was rationed, and the rations were anything but generous. But things did gradually improve, as the second fleet arrived in 1790, and a third fleet came in 1791. At first, the settlers lived in simple wooden huts, but later convicts made bricks for houses. As Captain Phillip left Australia in December 1792, when he returned to England, he took samples of Australian plants and animals. And it also took 2 indigenous people. First convicts worked on government land for provisions, but from 1793, those who behaved well were fed and given grants of land. Also, the free settlers arrived in 1793, and all their hopes of growing flax in Australia had come to nothing, but whales were hunted in the Pacific and seals were hunted in the Bass Straits. And relatively few people were sent to Australia during the long wars with France from 1793 to 1815, because the war at sea made it that difficult. Nonetheless, the colony continued to grow, and the second governor of Australia, John Hunt, from 1795 to 1800, was followed by Philip King in 1800 or 1806, when the first colonists settled in Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania in 1803. In 1804, a new settlement was founded at Newcastle for convicts who committed a second offence. And in 1813, Europeans discovered a pass through Blue Mountains, and it enabled them to spread inland, as Birmingham was founded in 1829. Bathurst and Goulburn followed in 1833. by 1825. The white population of Australia was about 25,000, while Tasmania has a population of about 4,500. As transportation to South Wales ended in 1840, and transportation to Australia ended in 1868, and the system of granting land to people ended in 1831, and from then on, land in Australia was sold. Well, it didn't go over so smoothly in Australia at the beginning of the 18th century. In March 1804, some Irish convicts, led by Philip Cunningham, took part in a rebellion at Castle Hill, and on the 4th of March they captured a convict station at Parramatta, and the next day they fought a battle with government soldiers, and as a result the rebellion quickly collapsed and the ringleaders were hanged. And a second rebellion, the Rum Rebellion, occurred in 1808. The famous captain of the Bounty was made governor in 1806, and at the time rum was used as currency in Australia, as Bligh forbade this. However, on the 26th of January 1808, a group of soldiers led by Major George Johnson arrested Bligh, and he was held prisoner for over a year until he finally agreed to leave Australia. And soon after he set sail, Bligh decided to return, and in 1809 the British government decided to replace Bligh, and in 1810 he was succeeded by Colonel Macquarie. In 1797 merino sheep were brought to Australia, and the number of sheep in Australia quickly boomed as there was a huge demand for wool in England. In 1820 there were 100,000 sheep in Australia. By 1830 the figure had reached 1 million, and there were 1 million sheep in Tasmania, and by 1850 there were 13 million sheep in New South Wales alone, and by 1850 half of all wool woven in Britain came from Australia and Tasmania. And in 1798 George Bass and Matthew Flinders sailed through the Straits and proved that Van Diemen's Land was separate from the mainland Australia, and the first settlers arrived at Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania, in 1803, as Launceston was founded in 1805, Hobart was founded in 1804, and Launceston was founded in 1805. And in the 19th century there was a whaling industry in the Bass Strait, as there was also seal hunters until the 1830s. An important shipbuilding industry also grew up in Hobart, and in the mid-19th century. In 1825 Tasmania separated from Australia for administrative purposes, as transportation to Tasmania ended in 1853. And in 1870s tin was discovered in Tasmania, and a new industry grew up. In the 1890s copper mining in Tasmania boomed, and the population of Tasmania grew rapidly, from about 4,500 in 1820 to 57,000 in 1861 and 115,000 in 1881, and the University of Tasmania was founded in 1890. And in 1803 there may have been about 8,000 people in Tasmania. As Europeans killed many, especially during the Black War of the 1820s. Other diseases introduced by Europeans, the warfare between Europeans and indigenous people began in 1804. And with the Battle of Risdon Cove, about 300 indigenous people stumbled onto a European camp while hunting kangaroo, and the soldiers fired at many of them, as many of the indigenous Tasmanians were killed in the ensuing years. As the governor of Tasmania from 1812 1824 to 1837 was George Arthur, and in the years of 1828 to 1832 he declared martial law, hoping to end the warfare between Europeans and indigenous people. And in 1830 he ordered all able-bodied white men to form a line across Tasmania. And sweep across it, forcing all the remaining indigenous people onto the Tasman Peninsula. However, this move, known as the Black Line, failed. Eventually, a preacher named George Robinson agreed to try and persuade the remaining indigenous people to go on a reservation on Flinders Island. Then surviving people agreed to go there. However, they continued to die out due to disease. And in 1847, the peace survivors were allowed back onto Tasmania. And as European settlements spread to other parts of Australia, Brisbane was founded in 1825, as Western Australia was founded in 1829, as the city Perth was founded that year. And in 1834, a man named John Batman decided the site of Melbourne was a good place to found a settlement, and in 1835 he made a treaty with the indigenous Australians, in which he gave them trade goods for land. However, the treaty was not recognised by the British government, which disregarded it, and thus the city of Melbourne was laid out in a grid-like pattern. And in 1836, another colony was founded in Port Adelaide, which grew into South Australia. The city of Adelaide was planned by Colonel William White from 1786 to 1839, the Surveyor General of Australia. And after 1815, thousands of new settlers arrived in Australia every year, fleeing poverty in Britain. By 1840, the white population of Australia about 160,000. By 1851, it had reached about 430,000. Meanwhile, such as Charles Sturt from 1795 to 1869 and Thomas Mitchell from 1782 to 1855 explored the interior of Australia. In 1851, Victoria was made a separate state from New South Wales, as Queensland grew from settlement at Moreton Bay, which was founded in 1824, as Queensland became independent in 1859. And when the first convicts and their guards were sent to Australia, they enjoyed to live in amity and kindness with indigenous Australians. But that didn't happen, as the Europeans came to drive the indigenous people off their land. Naturally, indigenous Australians resented this and they fought back. However, there were no pitched battles between Europeans and indigenous Australians, as indigenous people fought hit and run raids, and parties where the Europeans went out to kill indigenous Australians. And one of the leaders of the indigenous resistance was Pamoiu, who fought the British from 1790 to 1802. Although he was eventually shot, as European diseases such as smallpox, influenza and measles, to which he had no resistance, also devastated the indigenous Australians, as intermittent warfare between the Europeans and the indigenous people continued for decades, as the Europeans took more and more of the indigenous people's hunting land for sheep. Tension grew and violence flared, as indigenous people sometimes attacked settlers and took sheep. In retaliation, Europeans sometimes massacred indigenous Australians, as one such massacre happened on the 9th of June 1938, when a group of 12 Europeans massacred a group of 28 indigenous men, women and children. who were peacefully camped near huts belonging to 2 convicts. And out of the 12 men, 11 were brought to justice. And at the first trial, 11 men were acquitted. However, 7 were retried, found guilty, and hung. And it was rare for settlers to be prosecuted for killing Indigenous Australians. Although many, though not all settlers regarded Indigenous people as inferior, not really as human. And by the late 19th century, people of European vastly outnumbered Indigenous Australians, and a number of Indigenous people had fallen drastically since the beginning of the century, and from the end of the 19th century until the 1960s, half-caste children were taken away from parents, and in 1918 a law forbade a man of European descent to live with an Indigenous woman. And furthermore, in the 1950s, the Chinese kind of came to work in Australia. In the late 19th century, all the Australian colonies restricted their immigration. While in the late 19th century, Polynesians came to work in the sugar fields in the north, and in 1901 an Immigration Restriction Act was passed to stop Asian immigrants. And in 1951 there was a gold rush in Victoria, and the result was a huge influx of new settlers to Australia. And from 430,000 people in 1851, the population of Australia rose to about 1.2 million in 1861. And in 1861, Melbourne was the largest city with a population of about 125,000, with Sydney having around 100,000 people. And meanwhile, in the UK, 1854, the Eureka Rebellion occurred. The government introduced licenses for gold miners, and this was much resented, especially when the price was raised and the police carried out hunts for license dodgers. And the miners claimed the authorities were corrupt and unfair, and the resentment grew, and on the 17th of October 1851, the Eureka Hotel was burned. And then on the 29th of November 1854, the miners had a meeting under a new flag, the Eureka flag, and they were led by an Irishman named Peter Lalor from 1827 to 1889, and the men swore an oath to defend the rights and liberties. And they demanded not just an end to licenses, but also political reform. And on the 2nd of December 1854, they erected a stockade at Eureka Lead. However, during the early morning of the 3rd of December 1854, soldiers and police attacked the stockade, and the exact number of people who killed is not known, but was believed to be around 30. And following the battle, 120 men were captured and 13 were sent to trial, but were acquitted. And despite the collapse of the rebellion, all the demands of the rebels were met, and the licenses were abolished, as the Eureka Rebellion entered Australian folklore as a fight for liberty. In 1998, the Eureka Stockade Centre opened to commemorate the event. And in August 1860, 18 men led by Robert Burke from 1821 to 1861, and William Willis, 1834 to 1861, set out in an attempt to cross Australia from north to south. They had 23 horses, 23 camels with them, and when they reached Menindee in October 1860, Burke split the expedition. An advance party would go to Cooper's Creek, and the rest of the expedition would follow them. And Burke reached Cooper's Creek on the 11th of November 1860. However, he decided to continue out waiting for the rest of the expedition to arrive with the rest of the supplies, and he took 3 men with him: William Wills, Charles Gray, and John King. And they had 1 horse and 6 camels, and a man named William Brahe was left in charge of the supplies at Cooper's Creek. And on the 9th of February 1861, Burke, Wales, Grey and King reached Salter Creek and realised they were near the sea. However, they were unable to reach the sea, as instead they turned back and they were forced to eat the horse and some other camels. As Charles Grey died on the 17th of April. Meanwhile, William Breyer waited at Cooper's Creek until the 21st of April, but decided to leave only hours before Burke, Wills and King returned. As Burke and Wills both died of starvation and only King survived, and as he was rescued by the indigenous Australians. And in the late 19th century, Northern Australia began to grow. Darwin was founded in 1869 and 1872. The overland telegraph was made by Darwin from Darwin to Adelaide. Cattle was very important to the northern economy, and because of the hot climates, there was also sugar plantations. And in 1901, the population of Australia was 3,370,000. As the largest city was Melbourne, with a population of about 420,000, with Sydney still in second place with 360,000. As Adelaide was about 150,000, Brisbane about 86,000. As Hobart was a lot smaller with only 34,000. Meanwhile, Australia gained its first universities. Sydney University was founded in 1850 and it was followed by Melbourne University in 1853 and Adelaide University in 1874. And there was also a railway boom in Australia in the late 19th century. The first railways in Australia were built in the early 1850s, and there was still only about 1,600 miles of railway in 1875, and by 1991 there was over 110,000 miles of railway. As communications also improved with the invention of the telephone. As the first telephone call in Australia was made in Melbourne in 1878, as the telephone exchanges opened in Melbourne and Brisbane in 1880, Sydney in 1881, Adelaide, Hobart and Launceston in 1883 and Perth in 1887. However, in the 1990s, Australia suffered from a recession which was compounded by drought in the late 1890s, and not surprisingly, immigration fell dramatically during that decade. And on the other hand, gold was found in Western Australia in 1882, and another find in 1882, and another find a decade later in 1892. Led to a gold rush. However, this time the gold was exploited by large companies rather than lone prospectors, as the population of Western Australia boomed as a result of the gold rush. And by 1901, the population of Australia was over 3.7 million and was growing rapidly, as the population of New South Wales was about 1.4 million. And at the end of the 19th century, the different states agreed to form a federation. So the Commonwealth of Australia was formed on January 1st, 1901. And in 1913, a new capital city was built at Canberra, as Parliament Houses of Canberra opened in 1927. And after 1900, Australia recovered to some extent from the recession of the 1890s. But then came World War One, and then in 1907 a court case ended the Harvester judgment, which said that an unskilled workman should earn at least 7 shillings for an 8-hour day, in other words, just enough for a decent standard of living. And it became the basis of Australia's basic wage. However, in 1900, the bubonic plague struck a number of Australian cities, and in Sydney alone 103 people died. And at the same time in Sydney, also suffered an outbreak of smallpox in 1913, but only 4 people died. And when war was declared in August 1914, the first Australian soldiers left by ship in November 1914, and they were directed to Egypt, as Turkey was Germany's ally, and the British government had a plan to seize the Dardanelles, which was the narrow straits leading to the Black Sea, and they would enable the British and French to open a sea route to their ally Russia, and also knock Turkey out of the war. At first they would need to capture Gallipoli Peninsula because Turkish guns controlled the straits. But in April 1915, the Anzacs, which stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, were sent to Gallipoli. However, they were unable to dislodge the Turks, and the Anzacs were withdrawn in December 1915, having suffered nearly 8,000 casualties. As the Anzacs were then sent to the Western Front, and some 60,000 Australian men died in the First World War. And in the 1920s, immigration from Britain continued, and Australia continued to grow, as Sydney became the first Australian city to have a population of 1 million in 1922, and Melbourne followed in 1928, as Sydney Harbour Bridge opened in 1932. At the end of the 1920s, there was industrial unrest in Australia, as the waterside workers went on strike in 1928-29, as they followed by the timber workers in 1929 and the miners in 1929-1930. As the first commercial flight in Australia was in 1921 between Geraldton and Derby in Western Australia. And in 1923, radio broadcasting began in Australia, and in 1820, the Queenslander named Bert Hinkler from 1892 to 1933 made the first solo flight from Britain to Australia, and in the same year, 1928, the Flying Doctor service began. However, in 1929, the Depression hit Australia, and the economy slumped and unemployment rose sharply. In 1932, unemployment in Australia was 29%. However, that year things got better, and by the late 30s, unemployment had fallen to about 10%. And during the Second World War, Australia once again joined Britain in fighting Germany. And in 1940, Anzacs were sent to North Africa, where they played a vital role. However, when Japan entered the war in December 1942, Australia herself was in danger. And while Singapore fell in February 1942, 16,000 Australians were captured. And in February 1942, the Japanese began air raids on Darwin, and these continued until November 1943. And on May 31st, 1942, and on May 31st, 1942, 3 Japanese midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour, and one of them managed to sink a store ship, the HMAS Catabul, and with a loss of 21 people. Meanwhile, in September 1942, Australians fought in New Guinea and fought back the Japanese army. For the rest of World War II, Australians fought under the command of Douglas MacArthur, and some 37,000 Australians died during the Second World War. And after 1945, the Australian economy boomed, and in the 1950s and 60s, there was full employment and influence. Meanwhile, the Australian National University was founded in 1946, and the School of Air began in Alice Springs in 1951, and the television began in Australia in 1956 as the Sydney Opera House, a symbol of modern Australia, opened in 1973. And in the late 1940s, displaced people left homeless after the war in Europe were welcome in Australia. However, Asians were not, and as those Asians who had fled to Australia during the war were deported, Arthur Calwell, Minister of Immigration, said, "Two Wongs don't make a white," which is kind of slightly racist thinking about it. However, in 1960s, immigration policy began to change, and many Asian immigrants came in the 70s and 80s. And there were also many immigrants from southern and eastern Europe.